I get a message on a Friday morning, Liz Truss here, please call.
Did she acknowledge that there was a bit of a problem that had to be resolved?
The crisis was so obvious. It was clear to all of us that I was going to have to do some very big things. I don't want to be disloyal to Kemi Badenoch, but I would have made a different judgment on that. We really need Labour to take some big decisions. And the thing that has worried me the most has been the climb down over welfare reform. If they don't sort out the small boats problem, people will be very angry. They didn't come into office saying this is a really difficult problem to sort out and we're going to do our best. They came into office saying we're going to smash the gangs and we're going to do this. There couldn't be someone less suited to being Prime Minister in a pandemic than Boris.
By then, did you sort of feel that the Tory days were running out? Because you could have thought then, right, I've done my bit, I've helped them through, but you decided to stay on, be Chancellor. And I just wonder what it's like to do that if you deep down feel you're going to lose.
It would be an absolute catastrophe if the Conservative Party went into another 3-month leadership contest.
Might you stand for the leadership again? Welcome to The Rest is Politics Leading with me, Alastair Campbell.
And with me, Rory Stewart. And today, a real treat for us, at least as far as I'm concerned. We've got Jeremy Hunt. Now, Jeremy Hunt is very, very unusual in being probably the most senior remaining Conservative Member of Parliament. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was the Foreign Secretary. He was the Health Secretary. He was the Cultural, Media and Sports Secretary under David Cameron, Theresa May, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. So he served under 4 different prime ministers in government. He ran for the leadership. I declare an interest here. I supported Jeremy when he ran for leadership against Boris Johnson. Before he entered politics, which is now 20 years ago, he was a businessman, serial entrepreneur, makes jokes about himself failing to sell marmalade in Japan, I think. Or perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that. But ultimately built and sold a very successful company and has remained when almost all the rest of us have dropped away, which is another thing to investigate when it comes to Jeremy. So many things to talk about. Thank you for joining us today.
We tend to start, Jeremy, with the very start. So you came from a military background.
Mm-hmm.
Your dad was very high up in the Navy. And I just wondered whether that was ever a route that tempted you.
I think if there'd been a war, I would have definitely joined the Royal Navy because I would have taken the view that's where the action is. And by the way, thank you for saying it's a treat, Rory. I'm a bit worried there may not be a treat for Alastair because of what I'm about to say. Which is that when I was at university in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher was at her heyday and I was a card-carrying Thatcherite. And I thought the action is in Westminster. So that was the moment I resolved to go into politics.
You didn't fancy the Falklands?
I didn't fancy the Falklands. My dad was very nearly sent to the Falklands, but didn't in the end get sent. But my politics have probably slightly changed over the years, it has to be said. But
have you gone from right to left?
I think I have gone from being a classic small state libertarian, kind of Elon Musk type conservative.
Now you are upsetting me.
I know. But I have moved to being someone who says that at the core of my being, we have to have decent, high quality public services as part of whatever it is that we are planning to do for the country. So that makes me a different type of conservative.
Can we stick on this for a moment? Because oddly, at the time you were at university, I guess you're roughly the same age as people like David Cameron.
Identical to David Cameron.
Identical.
He's about a month older than me.
And famously, people like David Cameron, George Osborne were not actually very involved in politics when they were at university. Unlike you, they got into politics straight after university when you went out to teach in Japan and do other more exotic things. Tell me a little bit about this sort of these odd choices that people make at 18 and 22. Why were you more involved in politics in university, but then somehow didn't, like them, become a special advisor immediately after university? What was going on in your head at the time?
First of all, they were just much too cool to get involved in university politics.
Cameron and Osborne, cool.
Cameron and Osborne, by my standards, I was a humble Carthusian. This was St Paul's and Eton, so they were in a different category, and they knew that university politics was deeply uncool. I was interested in politics because I was genuinely interested in politics, and I have to say that the university battles were pretty helpful training ground for what happens later on in Westminster. And I always remember, because I wanted to become president of the Oxford University Conservative Association.
Which you did.
Which I did. And I remember asking someone called Nick Levy, who was himself president, who didn't then pursue a career in politics, how do you become president? And he said to me, do you know, it only depends on one thing. It depends on whether you really, really want it. And I look at people like, for example, Robert Jenrick today, and, you know, I know that he's being loyal to Kemi, but you can tell...
He's what?
You can tell that he wants it. And you can tell he wants it. And I think the thing is that we laugh at that, but actually it's an important quality. I remember Tony Blair once saying to me in Keir Starmer's early days, what do you think of Keir? And I felt the jury was out at that stage, but he said to me, I have to say the one thing about Keir, he really wants it. And this is something that is one of the really important determinants of success.
Can I just sort of come in on that? Have there been times in your life where you felt that you haven't quite wanted it enough, that other interests, other parts of your life meant that at certain key moments you missed the killer instinct, which, for example, when you were up against Boris Johnson, that maybe in some sense he wanted it more than you?
Yes. And interestingly, although I've been very focused on a political career, if I was going to examine my career from a professional standpoint, by the way, I'm someone who tried 3 times to become party leader. And the fact that I failed miserably on all 3 occasions, I think there's a message in there. But I think you could quite legitimately say that one of the reasons is I wasn't hungry enough. I pride myself on having a wonderful family. That is a priority for me. And there are red lines that I won't cross. And yes, that may have been a fact. I think also in the case of Boris, there was a much simpler thing, which was that I was a Remainer, he was a Brexiteer, and the Conservative Party were never going to vote for a Remainer in that particular leadership election. But yes, it's an absolutely fair comment about me. And this is something I think Alastair will understand. But I think one of the reasons that my hunger declined over the years is because seeing the job of Prime Minister up close, it is a miserable shit job. And it's really hard to persuade yourself that it will be good for your mental health in any way at all. And I think the thing that really causes your ambition to wilt is the simple knowledge that I cannot name a Prime Minister in my lifetime for whom it has not ended in tears one way or another. And that is really depressing.
Thatcher, literally.
Yeah. Blair, I'd say that Blair, Major and Brown, in their own ways, it ended unhappily, but they have all rehabilitated themselves. But it took them at least a decade to do so. And then the others are all more recent. But I think it does make you look at this. And I do ask myself, I remember something you said last week, Rory, about the problems in the democratic system that we tend to underrate. And I do ask myself if there is a problem with our system that they don't have in America, for example, where it's perfectly possible for a president to do 2 terms and then step down gracefully and be considered an enormous success. British prime ministers, sooner or later, the press get you, the public tire of you, and things seem to go wrong. So that was a factor.
Did you come across Johnson, Cameron, Osborne at university at all?
No, the only one I heard of at university was Boris, because he stood to be union president or union librarian or some post in the Oxford Union. And so he was kind of known for that, but not on a personal level. No, not at all.
You were never tempted into the Bullingdon?
Never,
Club.
No, I wasn't invited,
Oh.
let alone I wasn't tempted.
Because of only going to a minor,
yes, I went to a minor public school.
Oh,
I wasn't on the list, you know.
Thank you for being so honest also, because I think often that I just interviewed a friend of mine who's a wonderful American politician, but of course because he still wants to be American president, if you ask him these sort of questions, talks immediately about public service, and you don't get much of the humor or the comedy of actually what it's like being an 18, 19-year-old trying to form your way towards politics. But the next stage you did is that you then went off to Japan, is that right? And that's quite an interesting dimension to you. I mean, you speak some Japanese. Your wife is Chinese originally, is that right? I mean, tell us a little bit about that part of your life.
So there I was at Oxford. I was inspired by Margaret Thatcher. I had a dad who worried about money for his whole life. I thought, I'm going to solve this by going into business, earning some money quickly.
Was your dad just like a salaried? Because you came from quite a... you were related to the Queen or something. What was that about?
I only found out when I was in politics and someone dragged it up from in Wikipedia. I thought that must be bollocks. And then I looked it up, and to my astonishment, there is this very, very distant link. But my dad was just a salaried naval officer. We were an upper middle class family, but no money other than his naval salary, which had a generous subsidy. I think still has a generous subsidy for private school fees, but that was basically the only...
Which presumably you wanted to turn down, but he insisted you went to this minor private school.
Actually, I got a scholarship, so we didn't have to have that discussion. But anyway, so I thought I want to start a business. And my first girlfriend when I was at Oxford was Japanese. I wished I'd studied classics, actually. I ended up very boringly doing PPE, like the ambitious little squit I was, and PPE was the thing to do. So there I am thinking I really should have studied languages. I love languages. I'm going to learn a hard language. So off I go to Japan. And then in my 20s, I set up a business exporting to Japan. My friends are Japanese. I come back to London. I have tatami mats in my flat. And, you know, if there is a God, he obviously has a sense of humor, because I end up marrying someone who's Chinese, and there could not be a more different culture. You know, Chinese and Japanese are like Germans and Italian. They are.
Hold on, Jeremy, there's something very interesting going on here. See, I was aware of the time when you made that terrible faux pas, when you said that your wife was Japanese, right? And people just thought you're a bit confused or tired. Was that the first girlfriend staying on in your head?
No, it was something different. And I'm going to do my first, and I promise you my only shameless plug for my book.
Oh, you're in a book, Jeremy?
I have. It's called Can We Be Great Again?
I know it is.
In that book, I actually explain, by the way, it's an optimistic book, and I hope Keir Starmer reads it too. But in it, I do explain how on earth I made this terrible faux pas. So I've been Foreign Secretary a month. And I arrive in Beijing for this very important trip, first trip to China. I am nervous and I over-prepare. And I over-prepare to the extent that I think not only these are the things I want to raise with the Chinese Foreign Minister, but here are 2 or 3 points of small talk to break the ice. And I had 2 points of small talk. The first was that we both happened to speak Japanese. I lived in Japan. He was ambassador to Japan. My second bit of small talk was that my wife was Chinese. And in the heat of the moment, I said, I'm so delighted to be here in Beijing because my wife is Japanese. And I thought, my God, the press must have left by now. I turned around and there was this wall of cameras. And the Foreign Office minder very optimistically said, I don't think that's going to be the main story, Foreign Secretary. How wrong he was.
So at some point you decide, though, to go into politics. And it's you've gone through quite an interesting moment, because when you're going to Japan, I guess it's a moment where Japan is still not very far off the moment where it was the great growing economy of the world, where, it become 50% of the size of the US economy. It was taking over Manhattan. And suddenly the world changed in a very, very odd and sudden way. Japan ground to a halt. China shot off. We're into the world of the single market, the WTO. Well, what's your memory of what was going on? Were you thinking about it in terms of geopolitics and big politics, or were you still mostly thinking, I'm working hard to try to get some businesses off the ground in Britain?
So I went to Japan because I was interested in the country and I wanted to learn Japanese. As a byproduct, I was quite interested in the fact that that was a period when everyone was talking about Japan overtaking America because no one could ever compete with the brilliance of Toyota car factories and their extraordinary way that they managed to get thousands of workers to cooperate and continuous improvement. As it happened while I was there and ahead of setting up my own business, I did actually fall in love with the Japanese model of capitalism, which I think is a lot more ethical than some of the sort of get-rich-quick side of traditional Western
and just explain how you would define the Japanese model of capitalism.
So the thing I liked about Japanese capitalism is the focus on the product rather than profit. They always say if you get the product right, the profits will look after themselves. And their definition of success is building up market share, in other words, getting more customers to choose your product. And they are very happy when a Japanese person sets up a business. I mean, this is a bit of a cliche. And in fact, their model has merged with ours a lot more over the decades that have followed. But, they're very happy if they don't make a profit for 5 or 10 years. Now, at the time, that was a very different approach to Western capitalism. But where it was replicated, interestingly, was the West Coast tech sector, where you also had, for the first time in our capitalism, a group of businesses that said, actually, we really don't care about making money. We're here to change the world. And, the original Google had a very, very strong set of ideals. What I think is fascinating is that, there was Japan doing incredibly well, and America invents the internet. Now we've got China doing unbelievably well. Question, is America going to continue to reinvent itself? Despite all the challenges of Trump and the universities, this is fundamentally a free society in the way that China isn't. And I don't think it's as clear as it was then with Japan that America is going to win.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Can I just ask you about that time of your sort of entry into politics? You became an MP 20 years ago, kind of seeing the end of Tony Blair and then the beginning and end of Gordon Brown and then David Cameron, and you straight into the cabinet with David Cameron. Just give us your take on you'd obviously watched them all in opposite from before going into Parliament as well. Just give us your take on what you see as the sort of strengths and weaknesses of all three of those.
So I think that when I arrived in 2005, I had absolutely no idea of these internal wars going on in Downing Street between Brown and Blair, apart from, speculation in the press. But to me, Tony was triumphant. Remember, as a new MP, you are very influenced by what you see in Parliament. And I have never since then seen a Prime Minister so confident and so dominant at PMQs, which is the moment of the week. And he was, I think, a truly impressive parliamentarian. And for me, it was always utterly fascinating that when he left, he said that he hated PMQs, but he got a standing ovation from all of us because he was such a formidable parliamentarian. And I think that, that was impressive, irrespective of what you think about his policies. Gordon Brown is probably the person that I've changed my mind on the most, because when Gordon Brown took over politically, he felt, as an opposition Conservative MP, pretty hopeless. You felt the government was unravelling. He was trying political tricks that were constantly getting exposed, like cutting the basic rate of tax when he wasn't a tax cutter, things like that, just gimmicks. Of course, there was this Conservative narrative of not fixing the roof while the sun was shining and trying to pin the whole financial crisis
deeply unfair
onto Labour, but this is exactly, of course, what Labour is trying to do with the 22 billion story.
Not quite as successfully yet.
But the interesting thing is that having become Chancellor, and it was only when I became Chancellor that I actually saw what Gordon Brown and Alastair Darling did in the financial crisis. And it was truly impressive. I mean, the fact that he'd been Chancellor, was able to get on the phone to his contacts and get the G20 together. And I realise now that sometimes you get this complete mismatch between what people think inside Downing Street and what people think outside. And inside Downing Street, I think Labour thought, Gordon's been absolutely brilliant. He's done an amazing job in the financial crisis. Surely people are going to recognise that. Outside, people felt miserable and scared. And also, I think there was a failure to be honest with people about what it meant in terms of austerity. And David Cameron was the man with the solution. So I think that was where my view changed.
Can I just develop that? Because we've got a little bit of an analogy maybe with that at the moment. So Keir Starmer's now just over a year into his time as Prime Minister. And at this stage, Tony Blair had a net popularity rating, I think about plus 34. David Cameron's about minus 3, and Keir Starmer's on about minus 54 at the moment. And yet you get the sense that inside Downing Street, they're pretty confident. And they find it very difficult to reconcile. If you're Morgan McSweeney or the inner circle, they think, we're doing the right thing, we're on the right track. And yet somehow the public feels Britain's broken, this really isn't working at all. Can you reflect on that a little bit? Is that the same thing again? Is it an analogy?
It is a bit, because you are in a bit of a bunker in Downing Street. And remember, you're seeing all these difficult decisions that you're taking every day, and you're feeling good about them. You're thinking, I did something really smart. And there are some, getting 3 trade deals, being someone as Keir Starmer is, who is essentially decent and low ego, has meant that he's been able to navigate both the Trump White House and Brussels with both liking him. And that is an impressive diplomatic feat. But why is it that George Osborne's narrative about the Labour government that ran out of money has worked and the 22 billion hasn't worked so far anyway? It's because alongside his narrative about Labour, George Osborne was doing some really big things. I mean, he cut public spending by 19%. I mean, that was massively more than Thatcher ever did. So he had a political narrative alongside real policy substance. But a year on, I think people still find it very difficult to discern what Keir Starmer actually wants to do. So if all he does is say, because of the terrible inheritance X, Y, Z, it just sounds like a politician slagging off his adversary, and that's why it doesn't hold water. Now, I actually want Keir Starmer to succeed. I'm a Conservative to the last drop of my DNA, and I always will be, and happy to explain to you why. But we have Labour now for 3 years, maybe 4 years, and we really need Labour to take some big decisions. And the thing that has worried me the most has been the climb down over welfare reform. All sorts of reasons why they approached it in the wrong way, but the fact of the matter is that this is something where, left or right, we have got a massive crisis on, and it's not sustainable to be signing off 3,000 people onto welfare every single day. And we all really need Rachel Reeves to come back at this. So that's where I think the biggest substance opportunity has been missed.
Can I ask just a small sidebar on that? Why did Kemi Badenoch not say, I completely support what you're doing on welfare, and therefore put Keir Starmer in an awkward position that he could have got his vote through with Tory support?
Well, I don't want to be disloyal to Kemi Badenoch because I'm a Conservative backbencher and I fundamentally know how difficult that job is. But I would have made a different judgment on that. I think we should have supported it. I think that they had some individual concerns about some of the details, which made them uneasy about supporting a straight cut in disability benefits that was being proposed. But in opposition, you have to be broad brush. And the fact of the matter is the welfare bill is totally unsustainable. It's bad for the economy. But most importantly, it's terrible for the individuals involved. Alastair, you know far more about mental illness than I do. But when I was Health Secretary, every doctor that I met said that if you have anxiety or depression, you need social contact. And what we should be doing for a fraction of the price of the increase in welfare spending is getting people better access to mental health. And that would have been the progressive way to win the argument over welfare reform.
Just on that, though, so, you know, when you were Health Secretary, we talked a bit about mental health, but there was something you said you did an interview recently with the Telegraph, I think it was, and you said that you felt that establishing this sense of parity between mental and physical health had been, quotes, a disaster for the benefit system. He said, by drawing attention to mental illness, we create an incentive, not just for people to use mental illness to qualify for benefits, but for people not to get better. Now, where I agree with you is social contact is incredibly important. But I sort of felt that was I think we have to keep the sense of parity between physical and mental health. And I feel that I'm worried about that because I think we're losing that battle at the moment.
Well, as far as the NHS is concerned, we absolutely should have total parity of esteem. So we should treat mental illness every bit as seriously as physical illness. I agree. But I don't think parity of esteem means giving exactly the same treatment to each type of illness. And I think where it's gone wrong is that where this has been applied to the benefit system is we've just said, you get 3 points for back pain, 3 points for anxiety, 3 points for something else. And we're trying to jumble them all together. And I just think if you look at the way the benefit system works, for someone who does have moderate anxiety or depression, and that is a barrier to work, if you then put them on a welfare package, which then makes them worry that if their anxiety improves, they may no longer qualify for the benefits that they've become dependent on, you are creating a trap for people. And that's why I think, look, the most interesting statistic here, this is a number here, so I promise you this is the last one I'll give you. The increase in benefits, working age benefits, since before the pandemic, 49 billion a year in real terms. The most successful part of the NHS's mental health programme is talking therapies. Recognised all over the world. People come from Sweden to see how the NHS talking therapies programme works. It costs less than $1 billion a year. So you could double.
That's why we need more of it.
Exactly. You could double the number of people getting treatment for anxiety or depression for a tiny fraction of the increase in.
So what you weren't, just to get that, so you weren't saying there that you worry that people are using mental health as an excuse to get benefits. Or are you saying that?
That may be happening, but my
Right.
biggest concern is actually that this is doing immense damage to people who do have mental illness. Look, let's call a spade a spade. I think there is an element of fraud, but that is caused mainly by something different,
Yeah.
which is a court ruling giving everyone the right to apply for benefits by phone. And I think that happened in 2021. That needs to be sorted out, but that's a different issue.
So, but what you are saying is that the part of the welfare to work is actually we need more and better mental health services.
What I think Rachel Reeves should have done, and look, it's easy to be a backseat driver and all that, but what she should have said is we are doubling, tripling funding for people with anxiety or depression to help them get back to work. Here's the amazing package we're going to do, but we're not going to make it a de facto part of the benefits system.
Jeremy, there's so many directions we could go in with you, partly because you had all these huge jobs, and I hope we can touch on a lot of them. Chancellor, you can talk about the economy, Foreign Secretary, talk about foreign affairs, but I want to stick on health for a moment because you and Alastair set off down that path. You were the longest serving health secretary I think we've ever had in Britain. And it's very unusual. I mean, people like me were sort of rotated in and out of ministerial jobs sort of every year. I think I went through more ministerial jobs than you did, and you've been in politics at least twice the length of time, right? So there you were as the Secretary of State for Health, and you really got your feet under the table, really thought about it a lot. And it's enormous. I mean, it's something like 40% of the day-to-day spending of the government. And we've got a health secretary now talking about moving from treatment to prevention and from hospitals to the front line and all this sort of stuff. And somewhere in the story is this cliche that we should be doing much more in public health, much more in prevention. And that's really where you get the bang for the buck. That's where you get the return. That's how you're going to increase life expectancy. Instead of which, we end up spending more and more and more money on hospitals. What's going on there on the basis of your 7 years at the helm to explain why we perpetually seem to be trapped in this world that doesn't at least make sense to academics on the outside?
Well, the first thing is that we all need Wes Streeting to succeed. And I think he is one of the most impressive Labour ministers. I want him to succeed. And I think it is often easier for Labour to reform the NHS than the Conservatives, because any changes we do, there is suspicion that this is a secret plot to privatise it or whatever. I don't think, that said, that this talk about moving to prevention, moving care upstream, treating more people in primary care than in hospital is anything new. In fact, the 2019 10-year plan that Simon Stevens launched had exactly the same principles. So the question is, can Wes deliver it? And he has said some encouraging things. So on the positive side of the ledger, he is bold and ballsy, and that's necessary. And he is avoiding falling into the very first trap that he could fall into, which is to use up all the money he's got on pay rises. And I am someone who thinks that this BMA strike is outrageous. But the real reason why it would stop Wes improving the NHS is that if he gave an over-generous pay rise to doctors, he would have to do the same thing to nurses and all the Agenda for Change workforce. And then there would just be no money left for any of these reforms. So he's getting that bit right. There's a bit that I'm worried he may not be getting right, which is that in the end, the reason the NHS is not succeeding, and let's be clear, the austerity narrative is justified when it comes to problems in the court service, prisons and local government. But since 2015, we've had a 34% increase in the number of nurses, a 37% increase in the number of doctors. If extra bodies and extra money, actually, because the budget has also gone up by a lot, were the answer, then we would have a transformed NHS. Instead, we have an NHS still on its knees after the pandemic. So the thing that I'm worried about is the reason the NHS is not working is because we infantilise all the managers throughout the system by turning it into the most micromanaged healthcare system in the world. Stalin would be proud of all the targets the NHS has. Nowhere else in the world does this. A French hospital, a German hospital, you might have one or two targets, but not the 30, 40, 50 that hospital managers and doctors have. And my worry is that by closing NHS England down, and centralising it in the Department of Health, we're going to have more micromanagement from the centre. Whereas if you look at public sector reform that's worked, particularly raising standards in state schools, which are now brilliant by international standards, that has been done by empowering heads, giving heads maximum freedom over their budgets, encouraging innovation in the ground. And that's what we really will need to see if we're going to have a transformation in the NHS.
Do you not think that as a country, so I will plug your book for you, Can We Be Great Again? Do you not think that we're slightly delusional about the extent to which we can deliver the sort of country with the sort of public services that we want and think we're entitled to without making some very, very big choices on tax, which at the moment nobody really seems to want to make?
It's a really central question. So I'm going to just give a very short summary of how I think we deal with that. I am worried that if we take that decision, which many people on the left think, look, let's just bite the bullet and raise taxes to pay for all these decent public services, we will basically kill off economic growth. That's what I'm worried about. And then we will end up with less money, not more money for public services. But then you have to have a solution. And
that has to be reform.
Yeah, it has to be reform. And so obviously the 5 to 10 year solution is to get economic growth back up to 2 to 3% with things like planning reform, which Rachel Reeves is rightly talking about, the pension reforms that she's going to be announcing, I think, very soon. Those things are great, but they take time. So what are you going to do if you need more money for not just the NHS, but defence is the other really big one, and you need it now? The only area where there is potential is welfare reform, which we've talked about, and public sector productivity. And that means encouraging innovation with all the potential of things like AI. Now, the reason everyone rolls their eyes when you talk about this, because government ministers love to talk about efficiency savings. I did, Rachel did. But the Treasury always gets this wrong. So if you want...
Including when you were there?
Including when I was there, but I did try and change it. If you want the police to solve more crimes, but fewer police officers to do it, what the private sector would say is, well, then invest in a fantastic new computer system that removes all the admin. Police officers do about 8 hours of admin a week. Cut that out, and then you can have more time solving crimes and you don't have to increase police numbers so quickly. The Treasury never wants to invest up front in those big new IT systems that make more productivity on the front line possible. And so we always end up with inefficiently run public services. So unless you take a strategic view as to how to make our public services more efficient over a 3, 4, 5 year period and put the money up front, it's never going to happen.
And just on health, and you said, Labour might be more trusted to reform the National Health Service. But do you not think that at a point we're going to have to reach some pretty big, bold, difficult, radical decisions about the fundamental of the health service? Or do you, when you say you absolutely agree with the principle of the National Health Service, does everybody in the Conservative Party buy that? Are we wrong to start thinking, well, maybe?
Okay, I can't speak for everyone in the Conservative Party, but I personally don't think we should change the model of funding. But you have to be honest that there are social insurance systems in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Israel, that actually get better outcomes, sometimes for less money than we spend on the NHS. But if you were going to move to those systems, you would have to persuade British people that the state should run a system where richer people can opt for the gold service and get better care. And I don't believe we would ever win that argument. So I think a much more productive argument is to say, how can we get the same standards that they have in Denmark or Australia or Israel with the structures that we have? Now, we don't have a free market in state education, but we've got the highest standards of reading in the Western world. We worked out a system through transparency, through Ofsted, going back 25, 30 years. There's been a cross-party consensus, which actually Bridget Phillipson has been the first person, I'm afraid, to challenge. But there's been a cross-party consensus that has made our state schools some of the best in the world because we worked out within the structures that we want to preserve how to raise standards. So I think that's what we should do in health. And that, I think, means if we were going to choose a country to copy, I would copy Sweden. What they have done is they have an NHS, but it's decentralised. It's done on a regional basis. There's much more nimbleness, much more flexibility, and much higher standards.
I must point out, Bridget Phillipson's not here to defend herself.
that was a very BBC moment. I like that.
Rory, come in.
Exactly, that's right. Except now I've become even more BBCs pointing at me like John Humphreys. One of the things I suspect if you were a teacher listening to this, is you would say, okay, maybe we're doing well by international standards, but we are absolutely exhausted, run off our feet, unbelievably stressed, underpaid, and that this drive for productivity is killing us. And I guess you'd get people in the NHS saying the same thing, while at the same time, and this is what I'd love you to try to help us understand after years running the NHS, we're in a situation where the number of consultants since 2019 has gone up by 18%, number of resident doctors by 32.7%, number of nurses by 22.9%. Meanwhile, the number of emergency admissions gone up by 2.9%, elective by 9.1%, outpatients by 12%. In other words, there is this incredible discrepancy since 2019 between the massive increase in the number of staff and the actual outcomes, which are going up much, much more slowly. It's not that productivity is flatlined. Presumably on those figures, productivity is getting worse and worse and worse.
It has. Something's gone wrong in productivity since the pandemic, and it's really hard to put your finger on exactly what it is.
Are you suspicious it's WFH?
I don't think
Working from
so. I don't think so. And by the way, a lot of those increases were driven by decisions I took as health secretary, because I was dealing with scandals like mid-staffs, and people were saying there just aren't enough nurses on the wards, and we need, more doctors, more clinicians. I think clinicians in my time went up by about 40,000. Rory, I think your point is a brilliant one, though, because the truth is, if we really want to have more productive public services, we have to carry the workforces in health and education with us. And without being boring about technology, I think the big opportunity here is AI. For example, in terms of marking work for teachers, one of the biggest burdens they have is outside teaching hours, all the homework they have to mark. There's a lot of evidence that computer programs can do that work for them. There's evidence that doctors could save about a third of their time by these computer programs that automatically update patients' notes, and they can just give instructions on a microphone as they're walking between beds on a ward. So I think those are the kind of things that we need. And I do think it has to be done in partnership. But it's a journey we absolutely have to go on.
Normally, Rory and I like to take people chronologically through their life. Can I jump back a little bit to your first big job in cabinet, which was DCMS? Again, I'm happy to plug your book, Can We Be Great Again? I sort of feel in myself, and I've said this a lot on the podcast, I feel the last time that the country really felt like oomph, power, at ease with itself, modern, was 2012.
The Olympics.
For the Olympics, yeah, which you were obviously, cabinet minister in charge of that at the time. And it sort of had been a cross-party thing, and there was a legacy attached to it and all that stuff. I just wondered whether you think I'm being unfair if I say that the decade of austerity and the decade that we had the Tories in power, that we somehow did lose our mojo. Now, I would argue, and you might agree, and might not say it as loudly as I do, that Brexit was a big part of that. But I think it was I don't think it was the only part of it. It feels like the country felt a lot worse at the end of that decade than it did in 2012. First
thing to say about the Olympics is that I was building on the foundations left by the late Thatcher. And it's an interesting example of how much progress is possible in British politics when there is some kind of consensus between the parties. And I think the other outstanding example of that, which I've got a chapter on in the book, is climate change, where consensus between the parties has meant that we've decarbonised by more than any other G7 country. What's happened since? My view is that in the sort of 15, 16 years since the financial crisis, something has happened to the country, which is actually not Brexit, that has never happened in our lifetime before, which is we've had three massive global economic shocks. The global financial crisis, which meant that in 2010, 1 in 10 pounds being spent by the government was being borrowed, completely unsustainable. We then had COVID, once in a century pandemic, and then we had a 1970s energy shock following the invasion of Ukraine, which led to...
And we had Brexit, which was a shock.
And we had Brexit, which was a shock, but it was a self-imposed shock. The other three were not self-imposed. And the result of that was that the governments in place at the time had to take horrible, difficult decisions to get the economy back on its feet. And I think, by and large, whether it was what Alastair did or what George Osborne did or what Rishi Sunak did or what I did, actually. By and large, they took the difficult decisions that had to be taken in an emergency, but they left people feeling incredibly bruised. And the point I want to make in the book is that living standards, GDP per head, which is the closest link to living standards, only went up by, I think, 14% over the last 14 years, which is something, but it's historically much, much lower than happened previously. And so we've got a national view of ourselves that our economy is absolute rubbish. And what we forget is that actually other people have been through similar trauma. And we're the sixth largest economy in the world. And one of the most interesting statistics that I uncovered in researching this book is that in 15 years' time, the independent experts, the Centre for Economics and Business Research, say in 15 years' time, projecting all global economies, where will the UK be? We will still be the sixth largest economy. In fact, we'll have closed the gap slightly with Japan and Germany, who are ahead of us. The real story, by the way, is that India, China and America pull further away from everyone else. But my point is not that everything is hunky-dory. It is just that, we have got the foundations there and we need to get our mojo back. And, my biggest worry, I'm a believer in open societies, freedom, democracy, all the stuff that we all believe in. But that is really now under very, very big challenge, partly from Russia, but mainly from China. Xi Jinping is a rational person. He's not a dictator of the style of Gaddafi or some sort of crackpot dictator who just wants to enrich himself and his family. If he was sitting in this studio, he would say, Alastair, I really do believe that autocracy is a better system than democracy, because democracies elect politicians who just want to get themselves re-elected and they're incapable of long-term decisions. To win this argument...
And there's a point.
And he's sometimes right. Absolutely. To win this argument, we have to reform ourselves and we have to get our confidence back. And that is the UK, but actually particularly the United States.
But the reason why I think the Olympics is so important is because that was the time at which not everybody, none of us can speak for everyone, but the public felt like they were engaged in that sense of something good and positive. Whereas now what we've got is a sense of the public pretty much looking at all politicians and thinking, you're all terrible, when, I know they're not. So how do you think how do we get that mojo back when the gene pool of politics is narrowing, when the pressures on politicians are greater, when the media landscape is more complicated, when the international order that we took for granted feels like it's eroding? How do we get the mojo back?
Two things, a boring one and an interesting one.
Okay.
The boring one is we need governments that actually do deliver. And I think, if I can put this politely, this is a work in progress for Keir Starmer's government. But, if they don't sort out the small boats problem, people will be very angry, because they didn't come into office saying this is a really difficult problem to sort out and we're going to do our best. They came into office saying we're going to smash the gangs and we're going to do this. So they have to be better at delivery. And I think and I know this is easier said than done in government. The interesting thing is that if we believe in centrist, rational government, then we have to learn to communicate like the populists. And I want to just share one story about Trump, which I think is the most interesting. This is not a negative story about Trump, by the way, but I just think is really interesting. I sat next to his chief of staff when he came for a state visit when I was Foreign Secretary, General John Kelly. Didn't survive very long, as most of his chiefs of staff didn't. A wonderful, true patriot. And I had a fascinating conversation. I said, what time does the president get to work? He said, 11:30 or midday. And I thought, this just confirms all my prejudices. The leader of the free world, and he doesn't even bloody bother to show up until midday. I said, what's he doing? He said, he's sitting in his private quarters in the White House. He's watching TV, CNN and Fox, and he's on social media. And then I thought you could look at this a different way. For the first time in history, you have an American president who, before he sets foot in his office, he knows what America's thinking, and America knows what he's thinking.
I'm not buying this.
Well, I'm sorry, Alastair, but I have to tell you that the party you support and the party I support, we are losing elections against people who do. Trump is spending 3 hours a day talking to his customers. And I would say that...
I get the talking to customers bit. That's the communication point.
Yeah.
But I think a president spending so much time, and let's be frank, Jeremy, he's watching television. He's mainly watching Fox, so that he can see who's saying nice things about him because that's how he likes to feel. And he's watching the CNN so as he can see, hope that he's right, that he's hating the right people. Do you really want our politicians to be watching TV all day?
Not really. And by the way, I wasn't. But let me just put it another way. Okay, so how did I treat the media when I was Chancellor? This won't surprise you. I did a media round maybe once a week or once a fortnight, intensely prepared by our civil servants, go through all the difficult questions. If I got through it without screwing up, sigh of relief, then I don't have to bother with the media for another week. And I think it was the same for Rishi Sunak. And by the way, I think it's the same for Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer today. Compare that to Trump.
Yeah, that's a
who
different thing.
He doesn't care if he makes a big mistake because he's going to be back on TV the next day.
And I support him in that approach. But anyway, we're not disagreeing about the outcome.
Yeah, well, I just want to develop this a little bit more, Jeremy. So I briefly ran against you for that leadership race against Boris, and I was wombling around with a smartphone.
You thrashed me, Rory, let's be honest. You did a brilliant job.
Were you on the stage when he started taking his clothes off? Were you in that
I think
one?
I was,
Yeah, he
actually.
was on the
Yes,
stage.
yes.
Much more specifically. Anyway, I was interested in this because I've been looking at this again with Zoran Mamdani, who's been running to be mayor of New York, which has been an enormous amount about him getting out on the streets, filming himself, interacting with citizens. And I do sense that there's maybe something there which you could do against the populace, that there's a sort of energy that the centre could take back by, as you say, taking control of social media in a different way.
Look, I don't think, by the way, I think he is a left-wing populist, actually, so I'm not sure. But what I think is interesting is, look, if it's about communication, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have got some difficult messages that they want to get across. And by the way, this isn't just about, what they think of their opponents. It's got to be what they want to change in the country. Why aren't they spending 3 hours a day explaining to everyone what they're trying to do? I think that actually we should learn from this because I want, centrist, rational politicians to start winning elections. At the moment, we're getting thrashed.
Jeremy, before we get into what sort of conservative, let's actually go straight to the Chancellor thing, because that was an unbelievable period in British politics where Liz Truss beats Rishi Sunak for the leadership of the Tory party. I don't need to ask who you voted for. And it's just mayhem. And we have this, she brings in Kwasi Kwarteng as Chancellor. We've talked to him on the podcast before, and even he seemed to think it was all a bit sort of weird and wacky. And then he falls. He becomes the sort of fall guy for the markets going completely crazy on the back of the mini budget that she was so proud of. And then you're by now on the backbenches and you get a phone call. So just sort of talk us through it.
I mean, I still can't really believe what happened, but I was actually on an away weekend with my long-suffering wife, Lucia. So there I am, a weekend away with Lucia in Brussels, of all places. And I get a message on a Friday morning saying, Liz Truss here, please call. It's from an unrecognised number. And I think it's a hoax. I think it's just probably a radio show presenter. There was lots of talk about a cabinet reshuffle happening. And I thought someone is going to imitate Liz Truss and make me make a fool of myself. So I said to Lucia, I'm not going to be fooled by this. I can't believe that they think I would fall for it. So I ignored it. Then I got an unrecognised number calling me, which was actually the Downing Street switchboard, which I zapped because I thought this would be the same thing. And eventually a friend of mine called me and said, actually, I think number 10 really are trying to get in touch with you. So gingerly, I called the number 10 switchboard and said, I think this is probably a hoax, but I had a message saying that the Prime Minister wanted to speak to me. Oh, yes, she did. She does. And anyway, they put me through. So I became Chancellor. And then there was a sort of period.
Did she acknowledge that there was a bit of a problem that had to be resolved?
I mean, what she said was, this situation is not sustainable. And I said, how do you want me to help? And she said, Chancellor. And I said, knowing this is a huge decision, and also, if I'm honest, not expecting it to be for very long, I thought probably I'm going to be the shortest serving Chancellor in history. I said, can I have half an hour to think about it? And I thought half an hour was the longest I can reasonably ask for. And then I had time to talk to Lucia and my brother, and actually, after 20 minutes, I called her back and said, absolutely, I'll do it.
Did you make conditions?
I thought about that too, because as you will know, that is the one moment when you have leverage. But it didn't seem very necessary because the crisis was so obvious that I think it was clear to all of us that I was going to have to do some very big things. And then this is the weird way that British politics works. You know, I've never run an economics ministry. I have a business background, so I had some instincts, but I had never been business secretary or worked in the Treasury. And at 5 o'clock, I become Chancellor. I work through the evening with Treasury officials, and then on Saturday morning, I have to do a media round to reassure the markets, including an interview with Laura Kuenssberg that we did as a pre-record. And you can imagine how I was feeling at that moment with my general lack of knowledge of, you know, how financial markets work. I'd never worked in the city or anything like that. But I look back on that week, and the first thing was that there was total unity of purpose with civil servants. I could see that the Treasury civil servants were incredibly nervous, and I thought, how do I reassure them? And I said to them, look, you need to understand that we're going to do the right thing for the country. And if that means I'm a Ken Clarke Chancellor who hands on an economy in great shape to his political opponents, so be it. We're going to do the right thing. Whether I succeeded in being that Ken Clarke Chancellor, historians will debate, but it created a sense of unity amongst us. But actually the biggest thing that I did in that week, in a way, is something that is much less known, which is that when 5 days later Liz Truss told me that she was planning to resign, I realised it would be an absolute catastrophe if the Conservative Party went into another 3-month leadership contest, which was what was going to happen.
Was it 5 days?
It was 5 days. So she appointed me on a Friday, and then the Thursday morning after that,
Was it 5? Wow.
she told me that she was possibly going to announced that she would step down in 6 months or have a leadership contest. And I said to her, if you're going to do what is in the national interest, you say absolutely nothing until the Conservative Party has agreed. They will do the whole contest, done and dusted, in a week. And I said, and just for the record, I won't stand, because otherwise that message wouldn't have had any credibility. And to her great credit, actually, she agreed to that. I mean, you know, you can disagree with lots of things she did, but that was actually a brave thing to do. And that's what happened.
Jeremy, can I just come to that? Because it must have been unbelievably brutal for her. I mean, as you say, becoming Prime Minister is absolutely the pinnacle of someone's ambition. It's something that she would have been working for much of her adult life. And she would have felt this kind of miraculous thing of winning the leadership contest, getting into that position, finally having the chance to do these things that she'd always dreamt of doing, all these big radical changes. And then the whole thing blows up and she's gone in whatever it was, 48 days or something. I mean, there's been nothing like it almost in British political history. I mean, it must be the most unbelievable psychological journey.
Yes, and I think you sometimes reinvent history and say, you know, it was inevitable that she was going to go really quickly after the mini budget. I don't think that's actually true. And we've tended to say that now looking back. But when she appointed me as Chancellor, her intention was that I would reverse the measures that she took in the mini budget and she would start again. And that was how she saw it. And it was actually only losing a parliamentary vote on the Wednesday night, so 4 days after I became Chancellor, which has nothing to do with the mini budget at all, but caused her chief whip to resign, that finally damaged her confidence so much that she decided that she had to go.
What I was hearing when you were describing those meetings with the Treasury officials was almost like, now we're going to have to run economic policy without much reference to over the road, because they've been a bit of a problem up to now.
Well, let me tell you what I think the biggest problem was. The Treasury officials were petrified by the summary dismissal of Tom Scholar, which he was the permanent secretary at the Treasury, the most senior civil servant, highly respected figure throughout Whitehall. Liz Truss and he had clearly not got on when she was chief secretary to the Treasury, and she decided to make this statement by requiring Kwasi Kwarteng to fire him.
Which you would think was a mistake?
A huge mistake. And the reason it was a huge mistake was not just because he's a very talented person, but because I then ask myself, and I've never really had Treasury officials confirm this to my face, but I asked myself whether, when the most senior civil servant's just been fired on the spot, if the Chancellor then presents a mini budget that is full of catastrophic ideas, how likely is it that civil servants will speak up? And I think as a cabinet minister, I'm sure you think this as well, Rory, we are here by day, gone by night, generalists who arrive not experts in our brief, but there to challenge. And what you need more than anyone else is civil servants who are prepared to say, that is a crazy idea, Secretary of State, don't do it, for these 6 reasons. And, if you don't have civil servants doing that, you're going to end up coming a cropper pretty quickly.
What did you think of her before when she became Prime Minister and you were going off to Brussels with your wife? What was your sort of sense of Liz Truss? I remember I wrote a piece when she became leader. I said, Keir Starmer might as well go home now. If she's Prime Minister, Labour are home. I just couldn't see anything other than a disaster for your party. So I was perfectly happy about that. But I just wonder what your sense of it was.
I didn't have that sense. I supported Rishi Sunak and I respected her for being ballsy, and I understood what she was trying to do, in the sense that, fun enough as we're still talking about today with Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, that the economy was in a state which needed radical surgery to get us back on our feet after COVID and the energy shock. So that I understood. But what I thought was a terrible mistake was the unfunded tax cuts in the mini budget, which caused interest rates to rise, because I knew then, and I think this is probably what made you think that Keir Starmer was home and dry, that ordinary families would then forever blame us for their mortgages going up. And I think that is what happened.
Yeah.
What did it tell us about the Conservative Party that they voted for Liz Truss over Rishi Sunak? I mean, I was, supporting Rishi Sunak then. So again, I was surprised. I wouldn't naturally have voted for Liz Truss, but she actually won quite comfortably. What did that sense about the sense of the spirit of the party? What was it they saw in her that made them prefer Liz Truss to Rishi Sunak?
I think what it said is that still, all these years on, a decade after her death, we are still under the shadow of Margaret Thatcher, because the current generation of people at the top of the Conservative Party grew up when Margaret Thatcher was at the height of her powers. Can you imagine if you are, a right-wing, idealistic person at university, to have a leader who is so forthright about the ideals you believe in, so unapologetic? In practice, as we know, she was a lot more pragmatic than she let on, but her rhetoric was totally uncompromising, and it made everyone high. It was an incredible thing. I think actually Jeremy Corbyn did the same thing to elements inside the Labour Party. But the difference was that Margaret Thatcher was a very successful Prime Minister, love her or loathe her, and, won 3 elections and did extremely well. So I think people saw in Liz Truss some of that Thatcher boldness. What they didn't understand was that when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, she was actually incredibly cautious in her policy decisions and very conscious of the vulnerability of her position, which Liz Truss wasn't.
She wouldn't have sacked the Treasury Permanent Secretary day one.
Can I develop that once more, Jeremy? Because the other leadership contests that I got, I get many leadership contests wrong, but another one which I got dramatically wrong and felt most painfully was you against Boris Johnson. And I hope most people listening to this will understand why I passionately wanted you to be Prime Minister and not Boris Johnson. And I actually found it very, very difficult to understand that the country would vote for Boris Johnson. I thought, look, on the basis of my constituency, Cumbria, most people seem to say to me, yeah, okay, he's jolly, bit of a buffoon, but he's not really serious enough or suitable enough to be Prime Minister. And I really thought Britain's never going to vote for this guy to be Prime Minister, and yet they did. I mean, was that not very painful for you to be not just beaten, but beaten by somebody like that? Did that not lead to a moment of sort of self-questioning? And
it was very painful, and I was very upset that he didn't keep me on as Foreign Secretary, because I felt that I was doing an okay job there. And
he asked you to be Defence.
He asked me to be Defence Secretary, but in Whitehall terms, that was a demotion. And even though it's actually a very, very important job, I felt that it was not the right start to our relationship, that he was saying the very first thing I'm going to do to my runner-up.
And who did he make Foreign Secretary?
Dominic
Raab.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was disappointed at that too. But, In a way, Rory, I didn't really think in my heart of hearts that I had a good chance of winning, because I could see going round the hustings, I could see the fact that I'd voted Remain and the fact that we just had a Remainer Prime Minister, Theresa May, who had come a cropper and been unable to get her Brexit deal through Parliament, meant that I was very unlikely to win. So I suppose I was kind of resigned to that happening.
It's interesting, though, because, I mean, Rory, I think, ruled out, said he just would never serve under the Johnson government, but you would have stayed if he'd asked you to stay on as Foreign Secretary.
Yes, I mean, I remembered Boris. I worked very closely with him when he was Mayor of London and I was responsible for the Olympics. And look, this is going to sound a rather conceited thing to say, but he had this guy called Simon Milton around him who was quiet, gentle, smart, and a fixer. And he made the Boris machine work. And I suppose I thought, well, maybe I'll be that kind of person. What I had not understood at all was that far from going for someone sensible and quiet and calm, he went for Dominic Cummings in that same role. So this was going to be a very different Johnson administration.
I just wanted to develop this because that also revealed something about Johnson, which is that a bit like there's a difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2, there's a huge difference between Boris Johnson as mayor and Boris Johnson as prime minister. I mean, Boris Johnson as mayor was quite a kind of liberal, centrist, progressive. Boris Johnson as prime minister was going full out. I mean, to start with, he booted out people like me and Ken Clarke and Nicholas Soames and David Gauke out of the party pretty quickly, brought in Dominic Cummings, but then went all in on a very, very radical style of, challenging Parliament, challenging the Supreme Court, trying to rewrite the ministerial code so he couldn't be prosecuted. I mean, and you were trying to also watch him handling COVID, which again, it seemed to me that he was sort of unusually poorly suited to, because his style of politics isn't really about careful attention to detail, looking at international data or any of this stuff.
Was that when you were chairman of the Select Committee? Yeah.
I think it was COVID more than Brexit that did for his premiership. And in the case of Brexit, we were in an appalling constitutional crisis. And I think you could make the case that it needed someone who was prepared to duck and weave to get us out of it. But there couldn't be someone less suited to being prime minister in a pandemic than Boris, because, this is a time for explaining to people calmly some very difficult changes, calmly, truthfully, some very difficult changes in our daily lives. He wasn't the right person in that role. In a way, for me personally, that was probably a slightly more difficult moment, because with my background as health secretary, I really did think, the pandemic would have been a moment which I would have felt more natural doing.
There is something I see as a link between the comments you made when you were talking about the new politics of communication, the sort of slightly horrifying vision of Trump spending 3 hours every morning watching the news and tweeting, the sense that politics is all about communication, the game, which Boris Johnson was very good at, and the other side of politics, which is running things well, administering things quietly and professionally. And my anxiety is that those things are connected. Oddly, the personality type that does the big, brash, good social media celebrity stuff is very rarely suited towards the business of scrupulous, cautious, thoughtful, truthful administration.
It's such an important point, but I am ultimately optimistic. We have had plenty of leaders in history who've managed to combine sensible, rational governing with brilliant communication. I mean, I would point to Reagan, Thatcher, Clinton, Blair. These are all people, actually David Cameron at his better moments, perhaps not quite so consistently as those other ones, but they did combine the two. Now, you need both. And I think my argument to people who want, rational government, what is rational government, by the way? It's such a trite phrase. It's government that actually persuades people to endure short-term pain for long-term gain. Persuades a country the value of deferred gratification and taking difficult decisions now because it'll be worth it in 5 or 10 years' time. That's what you need if you want a country to prosper. Now, pure populists, all they care about is getting votes, and that's an absolute disaster. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we learn to marry those two elements of government, strong communication and strong government? And I think that Labour and Conservatives, both in their own way, have been failing to do that.
How do you think Thatcher would have dealt with Trump? She didn't like showmen, really. She didn't really like liars. Although she was a woman, she didn't necessarily believe in bringing on women, but she didn't like misogynists.
Well, I think the interesting thing about her is that I think she would have found a way to make it work. And it would have been slightly different to the way Keir Starmer is finding to make it work. But Trump respects strength. And in the end, she never hesitated with Reagan to tell him where she disagreed with him in private, whilst giving him the strongest possible support in public. So I think it would have been a version of that. But I think she would have found it very difficult to support things like the Big Beautiful Bill with the huge unfunded tax cuts, because she was a housewife who believed that the bills had to add up. So there would have been some difficulties there, but I think she'd have had his respect because of her basic strength.
Your time as Chancellor, so when Liz Truss did go, Rishi Sunak came in and you carried on, and that was one of his first decisions. But by then, did you sort of feel that the Tory days were running out? And I just wonder I'm fascinated by the psychology of that, because you could have thought then, right, I've done my bit, I've helped them through, and actually I'm now going to go off and do other things. But you decided to stay on, be Chancellor. And I just wonder what it's like to do that if you deep down feel you're going to lose.
So the first thing is that it's an incredible privilege to do that job, because it is, people say, which is the job that you enjoy the most? Without a shadow of a doubt, Foreign Secretary. You travel around the world, red carpets, private jets, wonderful dinners, fascinating people, including Trump, by the way. He was a pretty fascinating guy to meet on a number of occasions. Nothing comes close in terms of enjoyment. But in terms of power, which is the other thing people care about in politics, apart from Prime Minister, Chancellor is where the power is. And I felt it was an incredible privilege over 2 years to do all sorts of things that I had been wanting to do for years. For example, the NHS has never trained enough doctors and nurses, and I put in place a long-term workforce plan. I was very worried about defence spending, and I increased that to 2.5% of GDP, saying that we would honour the recommendations for the infected blood inquiry. In the grander scheme of things, these are relatively small things, but they actually really matter for individuals involved. And so it was a great privilege to do that. So I never worried, what am I doing here?
Right.
But I did have a sense that the Conservatives were going to lose. And I thought the best thing we can do in terms of winning again in the future is to govern the country well in the time that we've got left for us, and to take wise and sensible decisions. And maybe this is the moment to say why I think it is actually in everyone's interest, even listeners to this podcast who have never voted Conservative, that the Conservative Party gets back on its feet, because I think it's really important, if the country is going to succeed, that we have a pro-business centre-right party and not a populist right-wing party. For all the sense that people like you, Alastair, think of the Tories as the old enemies, actually it matters for the British body politic to have a party that is rooted in the business community. And many people in the Conservative Party have come from business, like myself, and I think it's really important, if we're going to have a successful economy, that those instincts are represented in Parliament. I really worry that voice is lost in America now, and that lots of people who understand how business works are not seeing their voices heard in Congress when these crazy tariffs are being introduced. And so just as I think it's a very good thing for Parliament to have a Labour Party with its roots in the public sector, people who've been in education, the NHS, poverty campaigners, that's very important. I think it's also true. And so why am I committed to the Conservative Party? Why did I stand again? Why will I stand again if the party will have me? It's because
you can stand again.
As long as Parliament will have me, as long as my voters will have me, I will stand again. It's because I do think it's really important to have a centre-right party that thinks and cares about wealth creation.
Do you not worry at the moment that they're sort of swimming around rather naively in the same waters as Nigel Farage, and thereby helping him?
It is bloody tough. I mean, when you've had the biggest defeat in your history and people have thrown you out, they're not going to suddenly have buyer's remorse 6 months later and say, we got that wrong. So I don't think anyone would have done much better than Kemi Badenoch. But What we haven't done yet, and we now need to do, is to be an opposition party that's offering solutions. That's when I think the British political system works, is when you have a government that's being challenged and an opposition that is championing actual solutions.
Isn't part of the problem, of course, that Boris Johnson and Liz Truss damaged the brand in a very fundamental way? When we were in Parliament together, the basic story, I think, was, or the Tories would suggest, that Labour was sort of well-intentioned but not very pragmatic. And the Tories were, could be accused of being nasty, but at least they were competent and they kind of managed the money well and they kind of made the tough decisions, and they were sort of, they would portray themselves as kind of serious, practical people. And the problem really with the Boris Johnson, Liz Truss interlude is it kind of took that whole narrative away. The narrative which you sort of had with Thatcher and Major and Cameron and even to some extent Theresa May was really, really damaged. And that's very difficult to rebuild.
It's difficult, but it's not impossible. And I think that in some ways our brand was in a very bad way after the back to basics scandals of the 1990s that Alastair will remember very well. And Labour's brand was in a terrible place in the Corbyn years as well. And I think that what we have to remember is that in a general election, people are looking forward. And the question is, are you offering solutions to the big problems the country faces? But that isn't enough. You've also got to have mastered communications in a social media age. And I will say that I don't think we're there yet in any of the mainstream parties.
Honest Bob's really trying. Rory and I did an event the other day with several hundred business people, and we asked them, they were all sort of grumbling quite a lot about the government and grumbling a lot about your party and not really that keen on Farage and what have you. But we asked them who they thought would win the next election. I'd say the winner was probably a Labour-led coalition, was their thought, but there was zero who thought the Tories would win the next election. Do you think that's realistic?
Well, I think, we had to have a year of penance, a year of silence. It's pretty difficult to get out there in the media and win your argument when every good idea you have, people say, well, you were in power for 14 years, why didn't you do it? And that is the standard stock response that I and my colleagues all get. But things move on really quickly in politics, and I think we shouldn't underestimate the capacity of things to change.
And you've mentioned populism a couple of times. What do you think is the best way for A, Labour, and B, the Conservatives under Kemi Badenoch to deal with the rise of reform?
Well, first of all, you've got to be truthful to yourself and your values. So if you try and be something you're not, it's never going to work.
Yeah.
But secondly, I'm sorry to be challenging, and I'm sorry, by the way, to say this, or I'm embarrassed to say this to a comms expert like you, but I would say that if Keir Starmer was watching TV and on social media for a couple of hours a day, talking to people, doing stuff on, with the regularity that Trump does, I think Nigel Farage would say, my God, he's changed. I want to give you one example, actually, from a few weeks back. There was a clip of Trump who had his head around the door of Air Force One. Mm-hmm. I think it was a clip about Iran. And he was saying something like, I think the time for negotiations is over. I'm fed up with them. And then he got on the plane. And I suddenly thought, I've never seen this before. The choreography of Air Force One has always been so tightly managed. The president shakes hands with a few dignitaries, walks to the top of the steps, waves at the cameras, and then gracefully flies off. And here was a president with his head around the door that was open, just giving the media a clip, inserting himself into every single news package that evening. I think that's what Starmer should be doing. I think it's what Kemi Badenoch should be doing. I think we've got to get out there and be talking to people, but with substance. I mean, let's be clear. This is not about substituting a media strategy for substance. You've got to have both.
No, because the thing Rory and I constantly say about Trump is it's almost like watching a reality TV show, and it's compelling on one level, but it feels like bad governance. I do think that all politicians can learn from the way Trump communicates, not about the lying. I don't want them to go down that road, but just it's fresh. It's interesting. He says interesting things. He does it in an interesting way. And a lot of our politicians just come over as just a bit dull and a bit last generation.
One thing that is interesting is you described yourself as a young man as being maybe more on the Elon Musk vision of the world, the sort of Doge vision of the world. And love him or hate him, his view of the world is shared by quite a lot of people. And I'd express it like this. Basically, the view is government is paralyzed. It's all stuck up. It can't get anything done for whatever reasons. Sort of yes minister, civil service, laws, processes. You just can't get anything done. And of course, that's fundamentally, I think, what Liz Truss felt about the world. I felt like she was my Secretary of State when I was a junior minister, that there was this kind of blob. Now, you don't really, or you're not really expressing that view. Am I right that you're not really expressing? Why not? Do you agree that a lot of the public basically feel that government is the problem and that you need to be much more radical and blow the whole thing up to get anything done?
They do, and that's a big worry. The reason I said I was perhaps closer to Elon Musk was just because I was a small state libertarian. It was in that sense rather than in the sense of blowing up the establishment. My experience of civil servants is that they try incredibly hard to do what their elected masters ask them to do. I've very rarely had a sense that they were trying to thwart me or frustrate me in what I wanted to do. But you do need to keep at it, and there is a risk aversion in the system. And the risk aversion normally comes from the politicians in number 10, who don't want too much noise. They don't want a Secretary of State to have too many big battles. They want to keep things nice and calm, and that means that you can end up being overcautious in policy making. We absolutely do need to show people that our system of government works. And I think that we talked about the challenge from someone like Xi Jinping. He would say, I don't think democratic politics works because you're incapable of taking decisions for the long term. We've got to show that we can do that. And I think we do need some really big reforms to the plumbing and wiring of our democracies. But most of all, we need politicians who are prepared to make the argument for long-term changes and for the fact that we're not going to be able to solve problems overnight.
Jeremy, let me just try this one more time and then back to Alastair. I did feel, and I guess we're different personalities, I did often feel in government incredible frustration at how slow everything was, how something I'd asked to be done, I'd say, please do this, and then weeks later, people come back with an options paper saying, here are 4 options. And I'm thinking, wait a sec, I already told you what I'd like you to do. I didn't ask for 4 options about this, right? But I suppose that's them trying to deal with the problem of the fact they disagree with me. But Theresa May at the moment often says in speeches that she thinks the fundamental challenge to democracy and to the centre ground is delivery. But none of us really look enough at whether our actual systems of government are fit for purpose, whether there isn't a sense in which actually the whole thing doesn't quite work anymore. There are too many regulations, too many laws, too many processes, too much civil service structure, and it's just stopping practical things getting done.
Well, we should absolutely do that. I think one of the reasons I really enjoyed reading your book, and I was trying to think as I read it, Rory, why is it that my experience of government was so different to yours? And I think the main thing is that life is miserable for junior ministers because the whole of government departments revolve around the Secretary of State, and basically junior ministers are an annoyance to officials. And what I found was that most of the time, when I was health secretary, the biggest constraint on doing big, bold things, for example, I wish I got rid of all the national targets, which we have in the NHS, which make it such a Stalinist system. But number 10 would never have had it. They would have said this is going to cause too much uproar. And so that was a constraint. But on the whole, if a politician who's a Secretary of State wanted to do things, if you had stayed longer in DFID, for example, I think you would have absolutely been able to get DFID operating in exactly the way that you wanted to do.
And then the 2 successive governments would come along and cut all your funding.
But I have to say, you are right. We have got to get our system of government working better. Now, a really good example is why on earth, if we want to build a nuclear power station, does it take 5 years before you can get final approval to build it, and then another 10 to 12 years after that, if there are no delays, before it actually starts generating electricity? Why does it take so long to build HS2? I think if Parliament decides through an Act of Parliament with royal assent that we're going to do this project, then we've got to find a way of making it happen more quickly. And that would give people confidence that governments are actually able to do what we're electing them to do.
I suspect Xi Jinping has been briefed by the Chinese embassy here about HS2, and he'll be using it everywhere as saying, see what I see, democracy just doesn't work. You end your book with a sort of letter to Keir Starmer about long-termism. You said earlier you want him to succeed, and where I completely agree with you, I think there is a real danger that the governments that are in the sort of modern media democracies where the pressures are so great, social media has made it worse, it's really, really tough. I worry about the Xi Jinping message. I think it's not to be trifled with. And I think I worry about Trump in the same way. I think Trump doesn't really believe in democracy and the workings of democracy. So I guess my question is whether you think that overstates it, that the idea of dictatorship, autocracy becoming a real threat to democracy is something that we don't talk about and worry about enough.
We should absolutely think about this very, very hard. In fact, I think alongside climate change, this is the biggest thing that future generations will judge us on. There is a global argument between autocracy and democracy. I have no doubt whatsoever that in the end, freedom and democracy will win. I mean, we talk about the global migration crisis, but where are all these migrants trying to get to? They're trying to get to Europe and North America because they know in their bones this is a civilized way of running your societies for all our many faults. My worry, Alastair, is that in the last century, freedom won, but it took us 2 world wars, a Cold War and a Holocaust to get there. In other words, we had to go through hell and back in order to get to the point where the Berlin Wall fell and people recognised the power of open societies. I think this time round, the question is whether we're going to be able to avoid tragedies on the way there.
And how worried are you about Trump?
Well, I think Trump is never going to champion democratic values. That's not his style. And because I believe in them, and because fundamentally I think that Britain has pretty good economic fundamentals, I want us to form the strongest possible alliances with countries that share those values, whether it's European countries or whether it's Japan or Australia or Canada, so that we are championing those values. And I think in the end, they have a lot going for them, not least that innovation tends to flourish where there's freedom of thought.
Final one from me, Jeremy. When you came into the House of Commons in 2005, there were figures like Peter Tapsell in the House of Commons, who'd been first elected in the 1950s. An incredible time range. People spent a long time in the House of Commons. But when I look at the first government you were in, the first David Cameron ministry, and go down through the lists of secretaries of state who are around that cabinet table with you, you're basically the last one standing. It's David Cameron, gone. William Hague, gone. George Osborne, Ken Clarke, Theresa May, Philip Hammond, and on. Andrew Lansley, Michael Gove, Justine Greening, Caroline Spelman, etc. Maybe not all gone. There may be a couple still left. But the core big celebrity figures of the Cameron governments, May governments, and actually quite a lot of the Boris Johnson governments have gone. What's happening? Why, in a sense, are you increasingly feeling like the last man standing? And what's different about the way that you think about politics? Why do you seem to be becoming more of a sort of permanent parliamentarian when so many other people who were part of your intake have moved on?
I'd like to be able to give you a wonderful piece of spin and say it's my deep-rooted commitment to public service that has kept me there while others have fallen by the wayside. But in fact, there's a lot more chance to it than that. I mean, I unexpectedly became Chancellor. And obviously, as Rishi Sunak's Chancellor, I had to fight the next election because otherwise it would look like I was a rat deserting a sinking ship. So I did that out of a sense of duty. And then having decided I was going to stand, I had to fight bloody hard to win because everyone wants to win the races that they're in. But having been elected, I am actually enjoying doing something that you both do, which is writing. And I discovered that, you think you know it all. As I said to Alastair earlier, you think you know it all when you've been Chancellor. You answer questions night and day about the economy. When you sit down and start to write a book, you realise you didn't know the half of it. And I find that a very, very rewarding process. And, the thing about Parliament is it has this very weird thing, which is actually what Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves discovered when they had the welfare rebellion, that however big the government's majority, somehow it always attracts attention to itself and puts itself right at the centre of national life. And I don't know quite how it manages to do that, but I genuinely find it a totally fascinating place to be.
So you are going to fight the election again?
Yes, I will. Whether I'll win or not, I have no idea.
And let me ask you this then, because at the moment, Honest Bob is going around the place being sort of Liz Truss on steroids on Instagram and with those little films. But might you stand for the leadership again, ever?
No, I think my wife would have something to say about that. And look, I tried 3 times. I think that's enough.
Yeah.
I want to encourage you to think again, because you're the one person that would make me rejoin the Conservative Party and come in behind you. So
the thing is,
that's the endorsement you don't want.
I am the non-Conservatives' favourite Conservative, and that's why I never get chosen by Conservative Party members.
Well, listen, thanks for being so generous with your time.
Pleasure. Thank you both.
Thank you, Jeremy, very much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
So, Rory, there we are. I mean, as with, what is it about former chancellors that we get them in, and you didn't really want Kwasi, and I was thinking, Jeremy Hunt's been flogging his book. Is he going to say anything really that interesting? So I was a bit reluctant about him. We ended up with both of them, making them into two-parters. I found that very, very interesting. I know he's still a politician, but he really illustrates your point about when they're out of the front line, they can be much more reflective, much more thoughtful, much more interesting, I thought.
Yeah, it's interesting. Quite a problem, isn't it? I wonder whether there's a way of making politicians more like that when they're actually still on the frontline jobs. Because, of course, part of what works about it is that he's not too party political. He's pretty good at saying, I'm wishing West Reading the best. I hope Keir Starmer's going to succeed. I like what Rachel Reeves tried to do there, before he gets onto his disagreement, which you don't hear much of in frontline politics, presumably because they're worried in a very boring way that if they say something complimentary, it'll be thrown back at them across the floor of the House of Commons. Well, you said, you thought Rachel Reeves did a good job.
I think where he was right is that, we talked about the Olympics, we talked about climate. I think the public do quite like it when politicians aren't just, he would not be anything but a Tory, and he kept saying, I'm a Tory, I'll always be a Tory. But he didn't feel the need that maybe I think you do in active, permanent combat politics, constantly to denigrate the other side.
Struck by the fact that some of our listeners, I think, will be very thrown off balance, I imagine, particularly those who are more on the left, by him beginning with that sort of unashamed, jolly conversation about being a great sort of Thatcherite undergraduate in love with Mrs. Thatcher, president of the Oxford University Conservative Association, all that sort of thing. But it's also interesting the journey that he's been on, because at university, Liz Truss was the head of the Lib Dem associated president of the Lib Dems at Oxford, and she went on a journey in the other direction to become more and more right-wing. She's now full over on the MAGA Trump. He's gone from the Thatcherite right back, as he said at the very end of it, towards being somebody closer to me, in other words, the conservative who non-conservatives like.
Yeah, and so, One Nation and all that. I just thought he was very reflective and interesting and fair about some of these things. And, I came in armed with all sorts of stats about his dreadful record at the health department and the rest of it. I find it interesting just to hear him being much more reflective about being a politician and about being him. Because the point you made at the end there about how long-serving he is and what have you is that it's not just that he's seen so many people go, he's seen so many different stages and different colours, if you like, of conservatism. And he just sort of, keeps going.
Yeah. The thing that I would have pushed him on, if I'd been being tougher, and maybe I should be self-reflective, that having been overly tough with Gabriel Attal, I was too soft probably on Jeremy, partly because he's a friend and partly because I'm desperate to have some sort of vision of a Conservative Party I can get behind. I guess if I was being grumpier and more combative, I would want to know why he didn't achieve more radical reform when he was in those different jobs. And he pointed to that. Fair enough. He said, I regret the fact I didn't manage to get rid of all these targets when I was health secretary. But he did run that department for 7 years. He was the chancellor for 2 years. He was the foreign secretary for 2 years. Why is it, having been right at the very top of government for so long, he wasn't able to achieve the sort of stuff that he thinks needs to be done? And I wonder, and this is unfair of me to raise it at the end of it, whether he in government isn't maybe a little bit, and maybe this is what I was getting at with my Musk questions, maybe he is at some level a little bit too reasonable. And maybe there's a gap between what he thinks needs to be done and his real willingness to drive through. I noticed that the big success he kept trumpeting was education, which of course was Michael Gove, who's a more kind of radical figure.
And also that was, again, I could have come back loads about the Tories' record on education, but I just didn't want to get into kind of, slangy match about that and record against record. But I think it also relates to the point you made right at the start about leadership, whether you want it enough. I've only ever had a couple of sort of little minor spats with him, but I think he's genuinely a reasonable person who now comes over as being much more reasonable because he doesn't feel he has to sort of toe the party line. And even though it's perfectly obvious he doesn't really think that Kemi Badenoch's strategy is working, and I suspect he doesn't really get too excited at the idea of Bob Jenrick being leader of the Conservative Party. But even on that, he's sort of fundamentally loyal. You know what he's thinking and saying, but he's not going to give you headlines.
Just a final thing then for me, because I keep inflicting Tory colleagues and friends on you. I've inflicted on you Sajid Javid, Nadhim Zahawi, Kwasi Kwarteng.
No, I inflicted Kwasi Kwarteng on you, Rory.
You inflicted Kwasi on me.
Yeah. I got him on the tube and you said no.
What do you think, looking at all those people that you've seen coming in and out, is there a gap between how you as a good kind of tribal Labour person perceived all these horrible Tory cabinet ministers from a distance and how they actually come across in front of a microphone? Or what's your sense of them as a kind of group?
Well, I guess a bit like him, because I'm sort of really interested in politics and what politics is about. I like it. I like talking to people who've been through a lot and who talk about it in a genuinely reflective way. And actually, in his own way, Kwasi Kwarteng was very, very reflective about, talking very, very differently to the way that Jeremy Hunt just did. I still find it difficult that anybody, particularly a young man, could sort of be in love with Margaret Thatcher. I find that quite a hard sort of leap across. But, he comes from a very different sort of background. He's got very different sorts of views. But I think they've all been interesting. I don't mind talking to people of different politics. And I think that what I was surprised about with him, I think was, and funny enough, somebody that I see socially said that they'd heard Jeremy Hunt on something else, I don't know what, and said, God, if only he'd have talked like he talks today, I think, he might have become Prime Minister. And this relates to the point he's making about Trump, and the way that Trump communicates. And there's something in there. I think we were slightly talking at cross purposes. I thought he was saying, we should all sit down and watch television all day. He was basically saying that Keir Starmer should think much more about public opinion and then get himself on the television all day.
Well, Alastair, thank you so much for that. And that was fun. Thanks again.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.